Take these factors into consideration and you can't go wrong. What's up guys, Dan here and welcome back to a new video. If you're new to this channel, there's one thing you need to know. I make videos with and about the Canon 90D, the Canon EOS R, the Canon M50 and the Canon R6, which is filming right now. Okay, so what do I talk about today? Shallow depth of field, like blurry background. Can we achieve that with any lens? Well, there are three factors that we should be aware of and that we should master in order to be able to get the best possible results in terms of shallow depth of field, like if that's what we're looking for. Factor number one is probably the one that everybody think about when we think of shallow depth of field, the blurry background, and it's the maximum aperture of the lens. We know that the aperture controls the amount of light that passes through the lens hitting the sensor, right? Right. And we also know that when we set a narrow aperture, the image gets darker. The more we open it, the more light will pass through the lens and hit the sensor. It's measured in f-stops, like a wide aperture is usually f2, f1.8, f1.4, f1.2. If we go up instead, like f2.8, f4, f6, f12 and 16 and so on, we close it and there would be less light hitting the sensor. But there's something else besides the light that happens when we open or close the aperture. The more we close it, the thicker the space in focus will be, and when we open it, that space in focus gets thinner, and that's something you should keep in mind. That's one of the factors. That's not all. You can't just think, okay, I have a wide aperture lens, I can get the shallow depth of field, a blurry background, or I don't have a wide aperture lens, so I mean it's like f4, f5, f6, and so I can't. Don't think like that, because there are other factors, another two factors. One is the compression of the lens. When we use a wide angle lens, it would be more difficult to get the shallow depth of field because of the nature of the lens. Basically, the wider the field of view of the lens, the more it'll be difficult to achieve a shallow depth of field. Not impossible, but more difficult. So if we use a 15 to 35 millimeters or a 16 to 35, at 15 or 16 millimeters, of course it will be more difficult to get the shallow depth of field, even when the aperture is open wide and the lens is relatively fast. Like in this case, for example, this is an f2.8, that's its maximum aperture, and you see it's open wide at f2.8 and the background isn't actually melting. There is some shallow depth of field, but I mean, not much, because it's wide angle lens, right? Right. Okay, so if I zoom in, what happens? We get more compression. So suddenly what we have is more shallow depth of field, like blurry background, because now we are at 35 millimeters, f2.8. Let's go back here. So, maximum aperture and compression of the lens can determine the amount of blur in the background, but that's not it. There's another factor that, if you don't take into consideration, will cancel the other two, or you won't get any shallow depth of field, and that is the distance of the subject from the camera and the background. The farther the background from the subject, the more you're likely to get the shallow depth of field, no matter the aperture and the compression of the lens. If your subject is a person and it's standing like with a wall behind and nothing, what you get? For sure you don't get any blur in the background. I mean, or there's nothing to blur. Or if the distance between the subject and the background is not enough, there won't be much difference, between the subject and the background. So the background would not melt, it will not be blurry. So even with a wide-angle lens with a maximum aperture that's relatively slow, fast lens is one with a wide maximum aperture. A slow lens is a lens with a narrow maximum aperture. So even with a lens that doesn't have like an f1.4 maximum aperture and it's a wide-angle lens, we can get some shallow depth of field if we take into consideration these three factors. Keep the lens at its maximum aperture, no matter what it is. If you can zoom in like to 35 millimeters, it'll be better to maximize your results. If you can't, just do what you can with these other two factors. Keep the subject as close as possible to the camera and keep the background as far as possible. So you have to understand that you can play around. As long as you are aware of these three factors, you can achieve some decent amount of blur in the background, no matter what, no matter the lens. Let's say you have a telephoto lens, for example, a 100 to 400 millimeters, or a lens for crop sensor cameras like the EFS 55 to 250 millimeters. The maximum aperture of these lenses is f4 or f4.5. But as soon as you zoom in, it goes to f5.6. So you'd say it's not a wide aperture. It's gonna be difficult to get a shallow depth of field. Well, no, it depends, of course. It's not gonna be like the blurry background you can get from an 85 millimeters at f1.2, and not even like the 7200 f2.8. But I guarantee you that even with the maximum aperture of f4 or f6, you can get some decent blurry background. Let me show you. So what do you think about it? Leave a comment down below, hit the like button and subscribe if you ain't already. And check the links in the description to see all my gear stuff and things. My gear. And check the link to Epidemic Sound if you want 1 month of awesome music and great sound effects for free. In short, in brief, it doesn't matter what lens you use. Of course, it would be ideal to have a very wide aperture lens, like an f1.2, f1.4, f1.8, with the lens as telephoto as possible, like at least a 50 millimeters. Better if a 70, 85, 100 and up. Also, it's really important that you make sure that the distance from the subject you're shooting and the background and the camera is enough in order to obtain the best possible shallow depth of field with the camera and the lens you're using. So play around with the settings, take these factors into consideration, and you can't go wrong. Alright, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash the like button right now and subscribe if you ain't already, and I'll see you guys the next video. The next video will be in Toledo, and it's a collab with drones, stuff, things. Alright, so I really have to go now. I have to work out. So I'll see you. Bye.